Stop for a moment and think about the charge. Blasphemy. That is what you were told. That is the word that has been repeated century after century until it has become part of the very air we breathe when we talk about the end of the life of the Nazarene. We are told that a group of elderly religious men gathered in a room in the middle of the night heard a man claim to be the Son of God, and in a fit of theological outrage, tore their robes and handed him over to the Romans to be executed. It is a story of religious friction, of a dispute over the nature of God that turned lethal. It is a story that conveniently places the motive for the most famous execution in history in the heavens, and Spinoza suggests it is a story that hides a murder. Because for 2,000 years, you have been given a motive that masks a political and economic assassination. What if I told you that the centerpiece of every passion play, every Sunday school lesson, every piece of Western art you have ever seen, the trial before the Sanhedrin, was not just a miscarriage of justice? What if I told you it was legally impossible under the very laws those men were supposed to uphold? And what if I told you there is a suppressed text, discovered not in a library but in the grave of a monk in the Egyptian sands, that names a completely different set of killers? Now listen carefully, because if you understand the motive I am about to reveal, the entire history of the Western world begins to look like a coordinated cover-up. I am Malcolm. I spent 25 years as a lecturer in theology and the philosophy of religion before I realized that the documents were telling a story that the institutions I served were not prepared to hear. Today, I want to take you through the document trail that Rome and the early church thought they had buried in the 8th century. It is a trail that leads from the archives of Amsterdam to a cold reading room in Oxford, and it ends with a motive that had nothing to do with blasphemy and everything to do with the one thing that institutions protect more fiercely than their gods, their revenue. Let us start with the official version, the trial in the middle of the night. If you read the canonical Gospels, the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you find a narrative that centers on a religious tribunal. The Sanhedrin, the highest judicial and religious body in Jerusalem, is said to have convened at night during the Passover festival to judge a case of blasphemy. They find the prisoner guilty, but because they supposedly do not have the legal authority to carry out a death sentence under Roman occupation, they hand him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate, in this narrative, is portrayed as a reluctant judge, a man who washes his hands of the whole affair and only agrees to the execution because he is pressured by a rowdy, bloodthirsty crowd. It is a neat story. It is a story that fits a specific theological agenda that began to take shape in the 2nd century, an agenda designed to make the new Christian movement acceptable to the Roman Empire by shifting the blame for the execution away from the Romans and onto the religious leadership of the Jews. But there is a problem with the story. It does not fit the law, and here is the first thing they don't want you to ask. Why would a group of legal experts break every single one of their own sacred laws just to kill one carpenter? I remember exactly when the gears shifted for me. It was the early 2000s, in a small seminar room at a university in Norwich. The room had that particular smell of old dust, cold coffee, and damp wool that characterizes academic life in the east of England. We were looking at a copy of the Mishnah, the codified body of Jewish oral law that was being practiced and refined in the 1st century. Specifically, we were looking at the tractate Sanhedrin, which governs the rules for capital trials. And one by one, the rules in that ancient text began to dismantle the gospel narrative like a forensic report dismantling a staged crime scene. Under 1st century Jewish law, as documented in the records that Spinoza was among the first to analyze critically, a capital trial could not be held at night. It simply could not happen. The sun had to be up. It could not be held on a Friday, and it certainly could not be held on the eve of a major festival like Passover. It could not be held in the private house of the high priest. It had to take place in the Gazith, the official hall of the Sanhedrin on the Temple Mount. Wait, if the trial happened where and when the Gospels say it did, it would have been legally void from the first minute. But it gets even stranger. Under that same law, a verdict of guilty in a capital case could not be reached on the same day as the trial. The judges were required to go home, fast for a day, and return to see if they still held the same conviction. And perhaps most importantly, the Sanhedrin was strictly forbidden from convicting a man based on his own confession. The law required at least 2 independent witnesses whose testimony agreed in every detail. The Gospel account violates every single one of those rules. Not 1 or 2, every single one. Now you could argue, as many have, that the Sanhedrin was simply corrupt and broke its own laws in its haste to kill a heretic. But Spinoza suggests a more uncomfortable possibility, that the trial before the Sanhedrin never happened. Not in the way we were told. That it is a literary creation, designed by later writers who were not familiar with the intricacies of Jerusalem's legal procedures, to fulfill certain biblical prophecies, and to provide a religious motive for an execution that was actually driven by something far more terrestrial. But if there was no trial, then why was he killed? And who really gave the order? Spinoza, in the 18th chapter of his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, looked at this period with the eye of a political scientist rather than a theologian. He saw a Jerusalem where the high priesthood had ceased to be a sacred office and had become a political appointment, sold by the Roman authorities to the highest bidder among the local aristocratic families. The temple was no longer just a house of prayer. It was the central bank of the province of Judea. It was the place where the wealth of the nation was stored, and the men who controlled it were the most powerful economic actors in the region. And that is where we find the real motive. But before I show you the mechanics of that temple bank, I need to show you the document that Rome and the Church tried to erase from history, the one that actually names the killers and the motive they were hiding. I must warn you, what I am about to read from this suppressed text is the reason why, for 15 centuries, owning a copy of it was a death sentence. It was November 1992. I was working in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The light coming through the high windows was that flat, cold north light that makes everything in a reading room look slightly unreal, like a stage set. I was handling facsimiles of a discovery made in 1886 in Akhmim, Egypt. A French archaeologist named Sylvain Grébeau had been excavating a Christian cemetery when he found a small, humble tomb of a monk. And inside that tomb, tucked away from the world, was a small parchment codex containing a text that had been missing for over 1,000 years, the Gospel of Peter. Now listen carefully, because what this fragment says is the reason it was hunted down and suppressed in the 8th century. In the Gospel of Peter, the trial is not a religious debate about the nature of the Messiah, and Pontius Pilate is not the one who gives the final order for the execution. The text explicitly states that it was Herod, the local puppet king, and the high priests who refused to wash their hands. It was they who took charge of the prisoner. It was they who pushed for the death sentence. It was they who were the primary movers behind the entire event. When I first read those lines, sitting in that silent reading room in Oxford, I felt a coldness settle in my stomach. The silence of the library was suddenly heavy, almost suffocating. For centuries, the Western world has followed a narrative that exonerated the political puppet masters and focused on a religious dispute. But here was a text, likely dating to the same early layer of tradition as the canonical Gospels, that told a completely different story. A story of a local puppet king and a corrupted priesthood acting in concert to protect their own interests. Why would the institutional church hide this? Why would they label it heretical and order every copy destroyed? Because the Gospel of Peter makes the execution a political hit, not a religious necessity. It takes the blasphemy mask off and reveals the naked face of power. It shows that the trial was a smokescreen for a coordinated removal of a man who had become a threat to the stability of the local power structure. But what was the threat? What could one man without an army do to a system backed by Rome? To understand that, we have to look at what Spinoza saw when he turned his gaze to the temple itself. In the 1st century, the temple in Jerusalem was the economic heart of the Near East. Every Jewish male in the Mediterranean world was required to pay an annual half-shekel temple tax. This tax could not be paid in Roman denarii or Greek drachmas, because those coins bore the blasphemous image of the emperor or pagan gods. They had to be converted into the pure silver Tyrian shekel. The money changers were not just street vendors selling souvenirs. They were the currency exchange for a massive global financial operation. They were the bankers of the temple. And the high priests, men like Annas and Caiaphas, took a cut of every single transaction. They controlled the massive livestock trade required for the daily sacrifices. They were the 1% of the ancient world, and their wealth was tied directly to the continued peaceful operation of the temple as a financial institution. Spinoza, in the 18th chapter of his Tractatus, describes this with devastating precision. He argues that the decay of the Hebrew Republic began exactly when the priesthood became a hereditary aristocracy that prioritized institutional survival over the spirit of the law. He saw that by the time of the Nazarene, the temple had become an engine of wealth extraction. The purity laws were used as a mechanism to force people into a specific economic loop. You cannot sacrifice unless the animal is pure, and only our animal is guaranteed pure. And you must pay for it in our currency, which only our money changers can provide. Now think about the danger here. If someone were to challenge the legitimacy of that system, they wouldn't just be a heretic. They would be a financial terrorist. When the Nazarene entered that temple during the Passover festival and overturned the tables of the money changers, he was not just making a theological point about prayer. He was attacking the revenue stream of the most powerful and dangerous men in the city. He was disrupting the bank. Think about the timing. Jerusalem's population swelled from about 50,000 to over 250,000 during Passover. The atmosphere was a tinderbox of nationalist fervor and religious expectation. And here was a man from Galilee, a man with a massive popular following among the poor and the displaced, attacking the economic foundation of the temple elite and calling it a den of thieves. Spinoza understood this mechanism with a clarity that most theologians lack. He saw that institutions do not protect themselves by defending their truth. They protect themselves by defending their treasury. The high priests did not care if a Galilean peasant claimed to be the Messiah. Galilee was full of messiahs and prophets in the first century, and most of them were ignored. They cared that he was a charismatic leader who was successfully disrupting the cash flow and threatening the delicate political balance they had struck with Rome. And here is the part that usually gets cut from the sermons. The part that explains why Pilate, a man known for his brutality, suddenly became a reluctant judge in the official story. Pontius Pilate was not a philosopher judge. He was a brutal administrator whose primary job was to ensure that the province remained quiet and that the taxes flowed to Caesar without interruption. He did not care about a dispute over Jewish law, but he cared deeply about anything that looked like a potential riot or a bank run on the temple's wealth. If the temple's financial system collapsed, Judea would become a fiscal black hole for Rome. The execution was a joint venture. It was a merger of interests. The high priests wanted the economic and social threat removed before it triggered a Roman crackdown that would cost them their positions. Pilate wanted the political agitator silenced before the Passover crowds turned into an army. The trial was a formality, a piece of political theater, and the blasphemy charge was the convenient religious language used to justify a political necessity to the local population. I was at an academic conference in Leeds in the late 90s. It was one of those events held in a drafty university hall that always seemed to smell of floor wax, old paper, and damp overcoats. We were all huddled around a table with plastic cups of lukewarm tea that tasted faintly of the urn. I was speaking with a Syriac expert, an older man with silver hair and hands that looked like parchment themselves. He had spent 40 years reading between the lines of ancient trial narratives, looking for the things that weren't said. We were standing in a corner of the hall, near a radiator that was clanking but giving off no heat, and he leaned in and said something that has stayed with me through every year of research since. He said, "Malcolm, look at the silences. In every official record of the trial, there is a gap where the money should be. They talk about the soul, they talk about the law, they talk about the king, but no one talks about the ledger. And in the ancient world, as in our own, the ledger is where the bodies are buried. So why has this been suppressed for 2,000 years? Why keep the blasphemy story alive?" He was right. When you look at the canonical Gospels through that lens, you see the silences, you see the gaps, you see a narrative that focuses on a theological debate over the Son of God, while completely ignoring the fact that the man in the dock had just launched a direct attack on the most profitable financial institution in the Near East. That is what the Gospel of Peter and Spinoza's analysis allow us to see, the ledger beneath the liturgy. The suppressed text of Peter shows us a Herod who is desperate to maintain his standing with Rome, and a high priest who is acting as the enforcer of a system that made his family incredibly wealthy. And it shows a Rome that was more than happy to let the local puppets take the primary blame for an execution that served the interests of the empire. Why was the Gospel of Peter buried? Why did the church choose the blasphemy narrative of the canonical Gospels instead? Because a religious trial is far easier for an institution to manage than a political murder. If Jesus died because of a theological dispute, his death remains a matter of faith, something to be contemplated in a church. If he died because he attacked a corrupt economic system and threatened the interests of a wealthy elite, his death becomes a matter of justice. And justice is always more dangerous to institutions than faith. By the 8th century, the Gospel of Peter was being systematically hunted down and destroyed. Bishops like Serapion of Antioch were ordered to seize copies and warn their congregations against it. It was labeled heretical, not because of its account of the resurrection, which is actually quite spectacular and orthodox in its own way, but because of its political transparency. It pointed the finger at the wrong people. It told a truth that was too close to how power actually operates, even today. Spinoza, sitting in his small room in the 17th century, grinding lenses by day and dissecting the Bible by night, saw the pattern across the centuries. He realized that the sacred history of the Bible was often just the official history written by the winners. He saw that the corruption of the temple priesthood in the 1st century was the same kind of institutional decay he saw in the powerful churches of his own time, institutions that used the Word of God to protect their own political and economic standing. He wrote in his private notes that when a religion becomes an annex of the state, the first thing it loses is the truth of its own origins. He was an investigator of the mechanics of belief, and he saw that blasphemy is the shield that power uses when it doesn't want to explain its budget. So here is the question we are left with. If the trial was legally impossible, and the motive was economic disruption, and the real killers were a coalition of local elites and Roman authority acting to protect a temple bank, what does that do to the story you were told in Sunday school? For 2,000 years, the blasphemy narrative has been used to fuel religious animosity. It has been used to justify the persecution of entire populations for a crime that was actually committed by a small group of elites to protect a revenue stream. The cost of this theological mask is measured in centuries of blood and a profound misunderstanding of what the Nazarene was actually doing when he entered that temple. The Akhmim fragment was found in the grave of a monk who lived in the 8th or 9th century. Think about that man for a moment. He lived in a time when his superiors were ordering the destruction of this text. He knew that if he was caught with it, he would be punished. And yet he loved the truth enough to tuck that parchment into his own tomb. He took it to his grave, literally, hoping that one day, long after his bones had turned to dust, someone would find it and read it. He wasn't a heretic, he was a witness. In 1886, someone finally opened that tomb. In 1670, Spinoza provided us with the analytical tools to understand why it was hidden. And today, you have the evidence in front of you. The motive for the execution of Jesus was not blasphemy. It was a murder to protect a system. It was a political assassination masquerading as a religious sacrifice to ensure the money changers could keep their tables upright. It was the removal of a man who dared to suggest that the house of God shouldn't be a house of commerce. Now the question is, what are you going to do with this? Knowing is one thing. Acting on it is another. Does this change how you see the cross? Does it change how you see the institutions that claim to speak for it? Does it make you wonder what other blasphemies are actually just threats to a ledger? I'll leave you with that thought. Take care of yourselves.
In 2012, I spent 2 weeks in the Vatican archives. What I saw there, they never let anyone publish. Spinoza was right about everything, and I'm going to show you the evidence they don't want you to see.